This week, NES Works Gaiden visits the happiest place on Earth, a town ruled by cats. If you're watching this video, you almost certainly know Nintendo's NES output better than you do their Famicom work, and that means you probably know Mach Rider. The NES's first arcade-style racing game, as opposed to the brilliant but decidedly non-traditional Excitebike, Mach Rider gave fledgling NES owners a taste of how well the hardware could handle this style of game. It compared favorably to both Pole Position 2 on Atari 7800 and Hang On for Master System, both of which debuted a few months later, while adding a few novel elements to the mix, namely road combat and custom track design. The Mach Rider destroyeth, but she also createth. On Famicom, however, Mach Rider lands a little differently. Rather than being the first of its kind for the system, it arrives as more of a culmination, a fusion of many different elements that have already surfaced several times across the 2.5 years that the console has been kicking around in the Japanese market. For starters, take the forward perspective racing and shooting. Although we haven't seen forward-scrolling ground combat before on Famicom, Mach Rider does follow in the wake of Gamos and Sky Destroyer, adding the hectic unpredictability of fast, twisting roads to vehicular combat. And of course, it follows directly in the wake of F1 Race, a deeply traditional take on forward-scroll racing developed by the same contractors behind Mach Rider, HAL Labs. Mach Rider appears to run on the same basic technology that powered F1 Race, although it amps up both the speed and the complexity of the driving while adding in obstacles, enemies, and targets of opportunity for the player to deal with. In the default game, the rider has to manage her fuel, refilled by destroying roadside barrels in the tradition of Scramble and Zaxxon, while also evading hazards and throttling her gear selector to safely navigate hairpin turns without being smashed into from behind by speeding bikers. You can also play a sort of pole position style timed racer in which you need to travel a set distance within a certain amount of time, with fuel and lives not factoring into the equation. And then there's the custom track mode in which you can build courses and save them to tape for others to play. We've seen several games with level editors on Famicom already, and like the rest of them, Mach Rider supports the Famicom data recorder. This allows Famicom fans to plug in a very inconvenient daisy chain of equipment in order to record their masterpieces to audio cassette. It's not great, but it does give value and durability to the track designer, lacking in the American and European releases. Regions where the data recorder and family basic keyboard never existed. I guess the one thing Mach Rider's arrival on Famicom does have in common with its NES debut is that it inevitably has to serve as Nintendo's counter-programming to Sega's Hang On. Rather than taking on the Master System Mark III game directly, and the superior hardware powering it, which would have been a futile endeavor, Mach Rider instead throws a wrinkle into the proceedings by delivering a game about blowing things up. So it's like Space Harrier and Hang On all at once. And not quite as good or cool as either, but still, points for the effort. This week brings us what the Game Developer Research Institute has identified as another Micronics created game for Famicom. Does this send a chill of fear through your aging bones? Well, it shouldn't. Despite the developer's somewhat rocky reputation, Onyanko Town turns out to be pretty decent. I had expected the worst going into this episode because this game has a terrible reputation online, at least in the English-speaking quarters of the internet. But in fact, Onyanko Town turns out to be an updated take on that most classic of maze action video games, Hey-Nyanko Alien. Yes, that's right, the Famicom never actually received a conversion of Hey-Nyanko Alien until Columbus Circle published one a few years ago, but it turns out Micronics and Pony Canyon put together a variant on the game way back in 1985. And come to think of it, this is the first release we've seen for Famicom from Pony Canyon, another herald of NES and Famicom greatness. You'd think a team-up between these two creative forces would result in a soul-sucking abomination, or at the very least, a kinda crummy game. That doesn't appear to be the case, surprisingly enough. Onyanko Town has that vibe you get from a lot of NES and Famicom games of this era. It radiates the impression that it adapts some sort of existing media license into video game form, but in truth it actually does not. Like Clash at Demon Head, it does a great job of faking its fidelity to a non-existent license. In this arcade-style maze action game, you play as a mother cat who needs to find her runaway kitten and carry them back home, all while avoiding an infinite succession of dogs who, in classic cartoon form, have it in for the other species. In reality, of course, an actual dog would be over the moon to have a chance to interact and play with a cat, but maybe the premise here isn't that the dogs murder you and your child, but simply annoy you with their manic enthusiasm, which would be a fate worse than death for your average feline. The game begins with your kitten wandering off to do its kitteny things, after which you take control of Mom and set about searching through a surprisingly large and remarkably maze-like town. The city scrolls in all directions and appears to be about 3 by 3 screens in size, which, as I've mentioned before, represents a fairly impressive technical feat for this era of Famicom software. The maze of alleys and streets sprawls in all directions and offers no hints as to the current whereabouts of your kitty child, who meanders around in real time and has the potential to show up right away, or only after considerable searching. Meanwhile, several dogs will appear on screen at a time, making their roundabout way toward the mother cat, but with just enough randomness to their movement to make them dangerously unpredictable. Making contact with a dog represents an instant loss of life for your female feline, but you do have a few advantages over them. For starters, you move around the maze ever so slightly faster than they do, so long as you're unencumbered, which means you can outrun them as long as you don't get hung up on the scenery. Another factor working in your favor is your ability to jump. Just as in real life, dogs are mundane terrestrial creatures, while cats have a spring-like nature that allows them to launch into the air. You can jump 2 spaces forward, clearing any object that covers only a single tile. This includes dogs, scenery, and hazards. Onyanko Town incorporates fairly generous collision detection, so as long as you mostly clear a dog or other hazard, the game gives you credit for the work. This gives you an advantage as you navigate the town, allowing you to travel by routes not available to the dogs that pursue you. While they need to scurry along the defined paths, you can hop right over shrubbery and walls in order to skip to a new path, or in a worst-case scenario, leap over a dog that has you boxed in to a dead end. You can also jump the cars that appear along the roadway toward the center of the city and skip over open manholes. Of course, you can also just close a manhole to cover it up for safe passage, but it's more satisfying to leap over one and lure a dog that's in hot pursuit to its death. The manholes actually represent your biggest advantage over your canine adversaries. Only Cat Mom can interact with them by opening and closing the cover. Dogs can only interact with them by falling into the open sewers. Here, Onyanko Town reaches back into video game history to embrace that seminal classic Hey-Nyanko alien. The manholes scattered around this town work almost exactly like the pits your Heian-era constable dug to trap aliens. You can actively create a hole that enemies will fall into, and you need to cover up the hole before that enemy extricates itself and returns to its usual marauding ways. We've already seen this mechanic on Famicom twice in Hudson's 2 Lode Runner adaptations, but those games presented the dig and hole concept from a side view. Onyanko Town reverts back to the top-down perspective of Hey-Nyanko Alien, feels more like a direct homage to that game. Your character's ability to leap distinguishes Onyanko Town and makes it feel like more than a mere clone, as does the fact that you can't just create pits any old place. You can only create these drop traps where you find manholes built into the scenery, which means that you need to work strategically within the existing confines of the level designs. One of the world's very first video game strategy guides revolved around Hey-Nyanko alien strategies, but those principles don't necessarily work here. So Onyanko Town becomes more of a game about recognizing opportunities as they become available and laying traps where possible, scouting the location of manholes, or I guess cat holes, and trying to lure the wandering dogs into those pits. There's some nuance to how these work too. Like the stray kitten you need to rescue, the dogs and pits continue to remain in active play in the game's memory, and can interact with one another out of your sight. Sometimes you'll catch a glimpse of a dog falling into a hole as you scroll that space onto the screen, and can rush over to cover it up, or even cover multiple dogs in a single move for a chain bonus. Sometimes, though, you'll make a beeline toward a pit that a dog fell into outside of your line of sight, so you'll be caught by surprise as this unexpected pooch emerges from the manhole to tackle you. It's also worth noting that the mother cat can just as easily fall into an open hole herself, which isn't normally a concern but does demand precise play if you try to pull off the tricky maneuver of opening a manhole as you pass over it to trap a dog in hot pursuit. If you time it right, you'll score an easy victory, but a frame too early will cause you to become hoist by your own figurative petard. Your susceptibility to manholes also becomes an issue once you do find your straggler of an offspring. Once you catch up to the mother cat's errant child, you need to collect it and carry it back home to the starting block. This changes the nature of the game somewhat, as you can no longer move faster than the dogs when encumbered with a mewling brat, and you can no longer leap either. You need to navigate back home safely while avoiding the dogs, which become far more dangerous due to your newfound constraints. At this point, making tactical use of manholes becomes paramount, rather than merely a nice score bonus opportunity. Only by kiting and capturing dogs in the gaping maws of the city's sewer can you hope to return safely home. Well, that's not quite true. You do have one other action available, a sort of nuclear option. Scattered around the map, you'll spot occasional fish icons. If you collect one of these, you'll become invincible to attack by dogs. They can't hurt a fish-powered kitty. However, stealing the fish invokes the wrath of the fishmonger, who will set out in hot pursuit of the purloining pussycat, chasing you relentlessly for the remainder of the level. Unlike dogs, the fishmonger homes in on you pretty accurately, occasionally wandering down the wrong path, but generally more dogged than the dogs could ever hope to be. On top of that, the fishmonger moves more quickly than you do, even when you're kitten-free. And he's smart enough not to fall into manholes. You can only slow him down momentarily by opening a pit, but he stops and immediately replaces the cover anytime he encounters a hole. So this leads to a risk-reward consideration. Evade the dogs by your own wits, or accept the Piscean boon of invincibility and hope you can outrun an angry sushi chef. There's way more nuance and detail to this game than you'd expect, given its origins. But really, the only clue you'll find that Onyanko Town comes from the cursed combo of Micronics and Pony Canyon comes in the frame rate, which is pretty choppy and adds a little too much uncertainty to the more intense moments of action where you need to perform split-second maneuvers. As we move into the age of slapdash Famicom software by inexperienced developers and disinterested publishers, it's nice to see that names typically associated with substandard releases have their moments too. Honestly, most Micronics or Micronics adjacent titles we've seen on Famicom so far have been pretty decent, and the studio's dire reputation wouldn't really come into play until they began working on the more intricate Capcom and SNK arcade conversions that made their way to NES. The first of those, 1942, is but a few weeks away. That gives Onyanko Town a sort of bittersweet air for those of us who know what lies ahead in the future. A rare opportunity for Micronics to strut their stuff, create something original and fun, and generally show what they were capable of when not shackled to the task of interpreting someone else's arcade game for less powerful console hardware. You know, I've dropped a pin where Super Mario Bros. Appears in Famicom history as a literal, game-changing moment for the console and the medium. But at the same time, I realize it's not fair to compare everything to a cartridge that undeniably represented the creative and technical pinnacle of home software design in 1985. Sometimes, though, you don't really have a choice, and the arrival of Pac-Land a few months later was one of those times. Super Mario Bros. Surely owes a great debt to Pac-Land. Debuting in 1984, Namco's game removed Pac-Man from the top-down maze and dropped him in a side-scrolling platform game. You know, kind of like what Lode Runner did to the Hey-Nyanko alien concept. Oddly enough, Namco's Japan-based dev team seemingly took their aesthetic inspiration for their hero's adventure from America's decidedly iffy Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning cartoon. Pac-Man wears an Alpiner hat here instead of a fedora, and you need to rescue a fairy instead of dealing with the dread Mesmeron, but the overall look and vibe of the thing, especially the ghost designs, leans toward the Saturday morning aesthetic. And mechanically, Pac-Land hails from a lineage of Western console games like Pitfall for Atari 2600 and Smurfs for ColecoVision. It plays as a simple side-view platformer in which Pac-Man runs and jumps across a landscape, evading enemies and managing uneven topography and pits along the way. Unlike those older games, Pac-Land introduces horizontal scrolling to the mix, a feature that had been seen in shooters like Defender, and, more directly related to the style, Moon Patrol, but not in any character-based action platformer that I know of. The likes of Mappy and Flicky existed out there, of course, but those games simply expanded on the single-screen Donkey Kong concept by stretching the single screen into several that either had hard boundaries or scrolled infinitely. Pac-Land did something different by placing its hero in a proper landscape on a journey from start to finish, and then back again, and it established a new paradigm in game design that Nintendo would more or less lift wholesale a year later when they broke Mario free of his single-screen arcade origins too. The thing is, Super Mario Bros. Did a much better job of exploring this concept, delivering superior controls, more elaborate level designs, more compelling secrets, and generally, just a more entertaining experience all around. That's not a strike against Pac-Land. There's something to be said for groundbreaking innovation, and the rapid, evolutionary nature of video game design in the early 1980s meant that someone would eventually come along and build on the concepts presented in Pac-Land. It's just that Super Mario Bros. Did a nearly flawless job of it, perfecting the side-scrolling action format in a single go. Sure, it left room for improvement, but when a conversion of Pac-Land arrived on the same hardware a couple of months later, it did not bring those improvements. In fact, Pac-Land stands out for being a shocking downgrade from the source material, the most anemic-looking Namco conversion we've yet seen. Compared to the excellent fidelity of Namco's home takes on Galaga and Xevious, or the creative conceptual upgrades present in Battle City, Pac-Land looks and feels uncharacteristically phoned in. The character graphics, easily the arcade title's selling point, show up here tiny and timid. The backgrounds lack detail. And the controls, well, the controls remain true to the arcade version, unfortunately. Rather than using a joystick and buttons, Pac-Land used the same limited setup as the original Space Invaders cabinet. One button to move left, one to move right, and one to jump. Here Namco decided to map those controls counterintuitively in reverse of every other character action game yet seen on Famicom. The D-pad makes Pac-Man jump, while the B and A buttons make him move left and right respectively. It's a weird choice, and coming so soon after Super Mario Bros. And its intricate, liberating control physics and setup, it makes Pac-Land feel much older and more dated than it actually was. I mean, this was a 1984 arcade game on a console in 1985. It should feel fresh and cutting edge. Instead, it's more like the first crack we've seen in the mighty Namcot edifice. Everyone puts out a disappointing game every now and then. Sometimes things just don't work out as hoped. But this seems like the worst possible game for Namco to have stumbled with. This character, with this timing, it really makes you realize that the mighty Pac-Man coin-op and merchandising Goliath faced a real existential threat from Nintendo's hero. Donkey Kong never truly rivaled Pac-Man's popularity, but Mario? Well, Pac-Land plays like a changing of the guard. We truly have entered a new era of gaming. Next time on NES Works Gaiden, that icky feeling.